Okay, we have the subject of ballistic missile defense, which is technically very interesting and at a policy level very confusing and complicated. Our two panelists are Dr. Bonomo and Mr. Taiwu, Mr. Kim, I'm sorry, and I think between them they have quite a lot to say. I will make comments afterward, in part reacting to what they've said and those things that they haven't already said that are in my notes. But Dr. Bonomo, could you start?
Surely. This first Asan Plenum is focused on nuclear issues, but this session, of course, is on missile defense. Offensive ballistic missiles and the related missile defenses are often conflated with nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. We can see that most pertinently here in the 41st, I think it was, Republic of Korea U.S. Security Consultative Meeting, which talked prominently about how they discussed North Korea's missile and nuclear tests. But making this connection is much more common. You can find it in the U.S. military strategy for 2011. The European security strategy of the European Union makes the same joint conjunction. While in some cases this is a natural connection and even helpful when you're trying to think about the problems, the connection can also be misleading. There are reasons to have missile defenses that have nothing to do with nuclear weapons, and just as nuclear weapons can be brandished or even used in ways that have nothing to do with ballistic missiles. And this assumed connection between them is in fact one of a series of assumptions that can be made about missile defense, all of which can potentially confuse issues, mislead decision makers or publics. Now, to provide a focus for this talk, I'm going to discuss these assumptions in the context of South Korea rather than more broadly. And there's a reason for that choice other than the fact of where we're sitting. Only here does the nation face an adjacent hostile state with both nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles, leaving South Asia out of the question for a moment. I'm going to talk about four common assumptions that I've found people made in the literature, explain why then they can be misleading in the South Korean case, and make some final observations. And the first assumption is this presumed tight connection, of course. And of course this is natural. Ballistic missiles were associated with delivering nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War, and we even now know from after the Cold War that the Soviet Union intended to deliver biological weapons through ballistic missiles. Even today, U.S. defense against long-range ballistic missiles is largely about defending the U.S. homeland against nuclear weapons. You can imagine other WMD, but that's not terribly effective at those ranges. So that only nuclear weapons offer the assurance of great damage, the great damage that makes long-range missiles an effective, at least terror weapon. Not surprisingly then, the potential North Korean or even more potentially Iranian ICBMs are the focus for the U.S. national missile defense, which offers for the U.S. some hope of damage limitation and combined with some prompt response to actually defeat the threat to the United States. But that connection is then generalized too broadly for places like South Korea. A different connection, but also assumption, but also common, is that defenses against ballistic missiles are costly and technically risky, and in any event, there's something about practical far in the future. And there's a reason for this assumption. After all, Mr. Reagan made his speech in 1983 that kicked off the Strategic Defense Initiative, and that certainly would qualify as both an expensive and protracted program that we've engaged in since then. A third assumption is more specific to South Korea, that South Korean participation in U.S.-led theater missile defense, or TMD as it's called here it seems, that could be provocative to other nations, to China and Russia, who might worry that the defense, who do worry that the defense the U.S. is building against longer-range missiles might affect their missile forces. The ability to hold itself, the United States, at risk might in theory be compromised by some much larger deployment of the U.S. National Missile Defense Force in Alaska, but the current limited deployment is too small to really worry the Chinese and Russians. And these defenses don't really involve South Korea in any event. But Russia and China also object to the deployment of theater missile defenses as well. While the United States has it's called phased adaptive approach in the latest ballistic missile review for developing and deploying theater missile defenses both in Europe against the Iranians and in East Asia, notably Japan, which is more involved here. But the Russians have complained about both of these. The Chinese have complained about their relations with Japan. They see both Russia and China see these efforts at TMD as strengthening U.S. ties to these countries, and perhaps they see them as potentially threatening their capability to threaten these nations. And of course, South Korean participation would be provocative to North Korea, which certainly objects to virtually any activity that South Korea makes. Finally, one fourth assumption. The missile defenses are not too important for South Korea because much of its population, particularly here in Seoul where we're sitting, will remain threatened by short-range rockets and artillery even if ballistic missiles disappeared. And unquestionably, Seoul is at risk in any war from many weapon systems carrying conventional munitions or potentially chemical and biological besides nuclear. In the event of the war, the potential damage to Seoul and the loss of life would be quite great without considering a nuclear attack. But as policy analysts studying military or security issues, you have to look carefully at assumptions, because if you simply accept them, they can constrain your analysis after the fact, ruling out entire options no matter how you continue it. And in some case, when we look at each of these assumptions more closely, we see there are complexities or complicating factors. Interestingly, these complicating factors tend to weaken each assumption in the case of South Korea in particular. Start first with the assumed linkage between nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. Obviously, nuclear weapons can be used and delivered to South Korea in other ways, whether smuggled across the border or through special forces or through small submarines. These are not very practical for long-range attacks against the United States, but they certainly could threaten South Korea. And some uses would not even involve, at the limit you could imagine, a North Korean weapon being used as what the U.S. used to call an atomic demolition munition, buried on North Korean soil in the event of a war with the South going bad and an invasion happening into the North, to be detonated on North Korean territory. There's very little we can do to prevent such use, and certainly nothing that has anything to do with ballistic missiles. Conversely, South Korea in particular can obviously be attacked with ballistic missiles that do not carry nuclear weapons. After all, there's of order 600 to 1,000, depending on which source you look at, short-range ballistic missiles in North Korea, and they certainly aren't all carrying nuclear weapons, nor were they built to do that. They were built to carry conventional or perhaps chemical or biological weapons. Even South Korean cities can be threatened with chemical weapons with these ballistic missiles. Although with the risk that the United States would escalate the conflict as we have promised to do. All of these attacks are more threatening to South Korea than to other nations such as Japan simply because they're so close. At short ranges, these missiles and their numbers can deliver quite a tonnage of these weapons, which can kill many people, cause great destruction. Well, defenses against ballistic missiles can have roles in limiting damage here, and so thwarting the intent of the attack. For military targets, which could be a quite plausible early target for ballistic missiles, active defenses that can shoot down missiles can work nicely with other defenses, passive defenses or protection against chemical weapons, whether for groups or individuals. The missile defenses both reduce the absolute number, but also allow you to play games in the military sense of preferential defense, defending only targets that are particularly important, leaving other ones vacant or unused and letting them be destroyed. Perhaps they can even help limit damage to cities at some level. Now, they won't eliminate casualties, but they can reduce the number of arriving missiles. And there's also a political role here. We saw that in the first Gulf War when even relatively ineffectual PAC-2s, that Patriot ATM capability 2 missiles, which I'll be talking more about because of their particular relevance given the South Korean buy of several, even those relatively ineffectual weapons proved to be reassuring both in the defending Riyadh and defending Tel Aviv. Overall, then, there's clear military rules for defenses against shorter-range ballistic missiles that are quite independent of nuclear weapons and quite appropriate for the weapons carried by the large majority of any North Korean ballistic missile attack. The second assumption is cost and technical risk, likely availability. The key here is that the technology has, in fact, progressed, due in part to the investments we've made over the last 25 years in the United States. Defenses against some shorter-range tactical missiles have been developed, and in fact have been developed by other nations too. At least the United States, Israel, and Russia have fielded such defenses. Tactical here, I'm particularly interested in missiles like these Scuds, or modified Scuds in North Korea, which fly either largely or entirely within the atmosphere. That removes the ability to deploy many common countermeasures. And so they present, in a certain sense, a less complicated target and an easier one than the longer-range missiles that the national missile defense must face. Indeed, the planned Korean air and missile defense has been tapping some of these. They are buying, I believe it's 48, Patriot ATM capability 2 missiles, older ones from Germany that are being refurbished. And there are various radars being evaluated. For example, the Israeli Green Pine. I'm not sure which of those will end up being chosen, or if it even, perhaps the choice has already been made. In general, missile defense against shorter-range ballistic missiles has become, for many nations, yet another cost-benefit trade that military analysts are used to weighing, and not a high-risk long-term bet. But in the same sense, it's also not just a symbolic program, independent of military needs, or at least it shouldn't be one. The third assumption had to do with the objections that other nations, particularly Russia, China, North Korea, might make. For China and Russia, their primary objective is to handicap defenses against their missiles. And the short-range defenses that are appropriate or most appropriate for South Korea really have nothing to do with those missiles. Now, of course, Russia and China can and will undoubtedly still object. They certainly can hold at risk whatever they wish in South Korea with their longer range, much faster missiles against which these defenses would have little capability. But even they cannot even truly complain that the radars and command and control systems and such would provide useful information to the United States for some sort of thwarting of Chinese attacks or whatever. But nonetheless, they have second-order effects that the Chinese and the Russians could object to, in a sense, from their point of view. It may make defenses more acceptable in the world, and that could threaten their capability to hold at risk other nations. Taiwan springs to mind. They, of course, will strengthen relations with the United States, which they may reflexively, that is, relations between the Republic of Korea and the United States, which they may reflectively attempt to object to. And certainly this will be tied with the capability of the Korean air and missile defense system. The most limited system would have the least objections raised against it, but it would also have the least performance. North Korea, of course, will object to virtually any defense that would be placed here. Their current, prior to defenses being deployed by the United States, North Korean missiles had a certain sense of inevitability. They could be launched and they would certainly hit wherever they were aimed at in South Korea. Now, with defenses, that's a little bit at risk, and the sense of inevitability of helplessness against the threat is eroded. That's not something they should prefer. It weakens the North Korean ability to threaten or terrorize or frighten people. And of course they will object because it strengthens a U.S.-Korean relationship, which is not to North Korea's perceived benefit. Now, of course, also, the United States is deploying missile defenses in South Korea. We've put PAC-3s, the Patriot ATM capability 3 missile, a smaller and more agile hit-to-kill system. Aegis ships sail around in the oceans around. This makes any North Korean objection analytically weak, if you can think so narrowly. There already are defenses here, but nonetheless, they will certainly object and provides or causes a political problem for South Korean leadership. The fourth assumption was the vulnerability of South Korea and of Seoul in particular to attacks other than by ballistic missiles. The first problem with this argument is that it's misapplied. The vulnerability of South Korea and of Seoul in particular could be used to object to anything, whether you want to upgrade a main battle tank or buy rifles for the reserves. And clearly South Korea has decided that a conventional defense against attacks from the north is both justified and effective in lowering the risk of actual war. Defenses against ballistic missiles are simply another part of such defense efforts. Beyond that flaw in logic, though, there's more detailed problems with the assumption of vulnerability. Initially, in a conflict, Seoul and its civilians in general may well not be a target. After all, causing widespread loss of life seems sure to galvanize support from the United States, even if it didn't trigger a retaliatory strike because of the use of WMD of one sort or another. And of course, it would remove potential leverage for later in a war that the North Koreans may wish to preserve for war termination if some conflict were going poorly for them. It also avoids thinking that Seoul is at risk, does not consider potential courses of a conflict. The fortunes of war might well favor South Korea, which could allow some partial evacuations, time for that, or even local success in removing or overrunning the nearest artillery and rocket positions, further limiting the damage. And finally, and slightly further off, other defense systems are appearing to counter shorter-range attacks. The Israeli Iron Dome system has succeeded in intercepting some very short-range rockets. It's important here to keep such systems in perspective. They cannot completely stop an attack despite the name Iron Dome. To quote the Director General in Israel's Defense Ministry, Major General Reserves Udi Shani, this is not a system that can ensure interception of every rocket in every situation. These batteries, when they are deployed, will limit the number of casualties from rockets and will provide, in case of fighting, decision-making space. As that last phrase implies, these systems might have application in defending military forces as well. But still, even in the case of Seoul, such defense systems may offer a chance to reduce damage in the relatively near future if they're bought and deployed in some future expansion of the Korean air and missile defense. So from my point of view, there seem to be good reasons to separate these two subjects and to think clearly and analytically about nuclear weapons and ballistic missile defenses before bringing them together again. And there are a few, three more detailed points I would like to make also. Even if you agree about this, this is not an argument to immediately proceed with any and every ballistic missile defense. Rather, it's an argument to go and analyze them, to think clearly about whether they're worth their cost, for not all are worth the benefit. There's an issue of integration. Integrating U.S. and the Republic of Korean defenses is a political issue. It's treated as sensitive. But in fact, some integration is essential. For no other reason, these systems, the radars and the command and control, could well interfere with one another. In the first Gulf War, U.S. Patriot systems interfered with U.S. Patriot systems, causing some difficulties. That was not because we hadn't tested it. It's because avoiding this sort of interference is hard. And it's not something you can do quickly. It's rather something you have to do carefully over time. A still greater information would come from sharing information, for example, on the allocation of interceptors. Just to know that the other side is the KMD or the U.S. are shooting at that missile allows you to then shoot at another missile, as opposed to both of you shooting at one and no one shooting at the other missile. That's all very short of full integration. There's no commander saying, okay, hold off fire here, we're going to put all of our effort. It just allows the systems to work better. But this requires real efforts at integration. Second, there's an observation on the scale of missile defenses. The latest ballistic missile defense review, again, it increased the size of the U.S. theater missile defenses that we are developing. That is, it actually bought more. That was important because under the prior direction of the program, we were developing systems, but we were not buying any meaningful force structure of them. Now we've changed that so that the numbers of THAADs, of Aegis, SM-6, SM-3, those are going, SM-6 in the out years, are going to be increased to reasonable force structures that can allow them to actually counter some attacks. The same must be true in South Korea, so that an investment in 48 THAAD, or 48 PAC-2s as it is now, not THAAD at all, is hardly a comparable investment that would allow you to do very much. The second problem is that you must match the technical and operational characteristics of the defense with the operational capabilities you're trying to achieve with the defense. So defenses based as on a PAC-2 missile are good if you wish to degrade accuracy of short-range missiles. Their probability of actually killing a warhead, of destroying it in the sense that we would understand as defeating it, is very low, as the first Gulf War showed. To destroy a warhead, you need a better system, a PAC-3 for the short range, the THAAD or others. When the Republic of Korea is buying just PAC-2, they have to put them in a place where degrading accuracy is a sufficient objective that they can perform some meaningful function. Now, happily, I believe that the Korean Air and Missile Defense is planning, although it's not yet committed, to improving to PAC-3s and to buying perhaps even some Aegis interceptors for their new frigates and KDX-3s, I believe they are, which is would be a good investment. But the important point in the bottom line to me is that you need to think about missile defenses as just another military system to put into the trade-offs so you understand what you wish to buy, and then worry about the political implications of this and make your decision as part of the cost and benefit trade. If it is treated purely as a symbolic issue tied in some fuzzy and inchoate sense to nuclear weapons, you can lead yourself to make awkward investments that do not actually increase your security of your nation or your forces. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next we have Mr. Kim. Now, whereas Dr. Bonomo is a physicist by background and has worked on strategic technology as well as strategic analysis, and actually he and I worked together on ballistic missile defense issues a few years ago. But our next speaker, Mr. Kim, has a complementary background. He's a researcher at the Korean Institute for Defense Analyses and has written many papers over the years, some of which I've read and found quite good. And so I was very pleased to be able to have him here with us. And so he'll give another aspect of this issue. Please.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. My voice is not good, actually. Even though we may have some differences in philosophy, theories, and regarding the missile defense, I feel our two nations are going together into one direction, whether we agree or not, strengthening cooperation over missile defense. But still there are some confusions and differences in philosophies and thinkings. I'd like to introduce some confusions, questions, hopes, 4 different groups of questions, actually, which we are discussing in South Korea. This does not necessarily represent the position of government, South Korean government, or the Minister of Defense. This only is reflective of my own personal confusion. The first group of questions and hopes is pertaining to the technical limits. Well, Dr. Bonomo already talked about some of them, but still we have many questions in this category. For example, is nuclear attack defendable? Even though he said, we can separate missile defense and nuclear issues, are they separable? I really don't know. Is biochemical attack defendable? Can we really contain the damage of WMD attack from North Korea? You know all the geographic situation over here. You know, North Korea is nearby, and we are highly dense population, and the damage will be here and there. And who can contain this damage if there is any attack? You know, is even conventional missile attack defendable? Well, we talk about 48 the Patriot PAC-2 missiles, and we talk about SM-2, 3, 6, and how many of them will be sufficient to defend increasing number of North Korean missiles? They are aiming at our all military and important targets with over 1,000 missiles and above the C class. If we count smaller missiles, the number is really numerous. You know, so can we really defend ourselves from their, that kind of a threat? And, particularly, can the PAA, for example, defend North Korean artillery shells? They can pour, approximately 500,000 shells per hour. So, is missile defense useful to this situation? So, all these kind of questions are on and on. So the South Korean strategic planners should grapple with this kind of questions. This is reality. Of course, our government, our Minister of Defense, is constructing so-called the KMAD, Korean Air and Missile Defense System. Probably some of them. We have SAMX program, we have MCM program, LCM programs. So theories are already there. We need their programs. But the eventual question is, are they sufficient to defend ourselves from North Korean attack? So far, I have never found any clear-cut answers to these questions. Well, second, a group of questions pertaining to the political limit of missile defense. Even though Dr. Bonomo already talked about China's possible reaction and Russia's reaction, and is it true that the South Korean people is afraid of the deterioration of our relations with China? So is missile defense, a full option of missile defense acceptable to China? Why should we invite China's hostility by doing this, So will political leadership tolerate domestic opposition, even within the South Korean society? We have a chunk of a population who argues that we should not strengthen our cooperation, security cooperation with the United States. So even though I don't agree, I really don't agree this kind of debate within South Korea, but the reality is this is a political issue. The political leaders are very sensitive to this kind of issues. A third group of questions is regarding prioritization of in forces construction. We have a limited budget. We have a national goal, but the national goal does not necessarily coincide with the goal of each service within our military and the goal of specialty. Even within Army, there are many different goals from specialty to specialty. Artillery generals always want to strengthen artillery, tanks, and the helicopter generals only want to strengthen helicopter forces. This type of competition is always there. Then which one should we invest in first? This is a really big question. And the competition among services. This is again time-old problems. And the strategic weapons versus tactical weapons. This is also competition going on between even each services of our military forces. For example, Army, within Army, some officers want more missiles and more special operation forces, which has some strategic significance. But the others want more tanks, helicopters, canines, motors, and In Air Force, the similar debate going on. Some generals want more PGMs, and then the early purchase of stealth fighters, but the others want more welfare. Navy, yes, of course, the same competition going on. Persons like me strongly recommend that the South Korean Navy need more submarines. Above anything else, we should have more submarines, but still many Navy generals want surface ships. Why? Surface ships is big and large, and then it is good. It can be good reason to demand more manpower and more positions for generals. And see, this kind of politics is always there. So, how to prioritize the demand? This is a really serious question still we are asking. Well, finally, we have questions and hopes regarding the capability of our leadership, both political and military. Well, I hope our political leaders shares with the same concerns and agonies over how to protect these nations. But sometimes they don't seem that. They fight, to get more votes. Then they follow the popular issues, and I don't know how deeply they will try to understand these strategic issues. I hope they will, but I don't know. I'm not sure. And military leadership, even though I have been working for them for many years, but still. I'm not quite sure all of the generals in our top positions are really highly capable of protecting these nations. I really don't know. Particularly what I have in mind in this regard is deterrence versus defense. Missile defense is defense, but personally what I put more emphasis on is deterrence. This emphasis, of course, comes from the limitation in our technical capability in defending North Korean threat. If we cannot if we cannot satisfactorily defend our nation from North Korean provocations, then the better way is to deter, to prevent their provocations, rather than trying to defend or contain damages after provocations. Then we should have some different approaches to North Korea. Yes, it is right. The more defense capability we have, the less they will feel motivated to provocate against South Korea. It's true, But a stronger deterrence will come from our show of will and capability to retaliate, ruthless retaliate in case of provocations. Then our focus should move from the missile defense to retaliation capabilities. So this is a big strategic debate still going on among our strategic planners. But I don't know how much of this is accepted by our generals and by our military. I don't know. Actually, when I worked as a member of the Presidential Commission for Defense Reform last year, I suggested a new idea, so-called a South Korean version of a triad system. This is, of course, conventional triad, not nuclear. We need a numerous missiles, retaliation missiles, deployed in the air, on the ground, and under the sea. Without this, we cannot share the vulnerability. The sharing vulnerability is very important to me. North Korea is now making South Korea, all part of South Korea, vulnerable with the numerous missiles and nuclear and WMDs. But we cannot do that. We cannot do the same thing, So under this asymmetry of vulnerability, we cannot control North Korea. North Korea will not listen to us. So this is what we have been experiencing for many decades. First of all, we should share the vulnerability. And then we discuss we talk with North Korea. And, so that's the background why our commission finally recommended try the system. But the current the 307 plan, the defensive minister's plan for defense reform does not mention about the triad system. So personally, I don't know how deeply they are thinking about the vulnerability problem, how deeply they think about the importance of mutual vulnerability between two Koreas, how useful this will be to stabilize inter-Korean relations, and I really don't know. So, okay. I briefly introduced the four different categories of my questions and hopes. I'd like to very briefly mention to Dr. Bonono's statement. Well, previously I thought we have much differences, but after listening to you, the difference is not great, actually. Assumption 3, for example, I agree with you. We don't have to exaggerate China's reaction. If we have a philosophy, for example, strengthening alliance is the way we should go, even risking a little bit of deterioration of our relation with China. If this is the way we should go, then we should go. We should go. And even though you talk about the short-range missiles, defense against short-range missiles and long-range missiles, well, as a South Korean, I don't want to separate the two issues. They're the same. Everything is the same to us. But even though China or Russia can get a little bit angry, but we should do our best to make them understand why South Korea do this. And then we can try to improve our relations with China for some other areas. For example, economic interdependence is deepening. This is good phenomena, So I agree with you in that regard. I'm not saying yes or no regarding the South Korean integration into the U.S. missile defense. I'm not saying yes or no. What I'm saying is we need a philosophy first of all. If our goal is not limited to defending our nation from only North Korea, if our goal should extend to the post-North Korean era, then we should establish our goal and the philosophy, and we should strengthen our alliance in that direction. Thank you.
I will make my comments briefer so that we have some opportunity to have discussion with the whole group. One thing I would like to start with, though, is just to give you a very quick history of how things are different if you are thinking about ballistic missile defense from the U.S. point of view, and then end up with matters that relate more directly to South Korea. If you think about way back, World War II, of course you have defenses. It was not an issue, of course. In the 1950s, of course, you developed defenses as well as you could. There were no debates or issues about this, but we didn't yet have this problem of missiles with nuclear weapons. Those came in the 50s, and nonetheless, people continue to work on defenses. But in the United States, and in the Soviet Union for that matter, one of the things that happened was that technically it looked really hard. Defending against long-range ballistic missiles was just technically difficult if the attacker was technically competent. Countermeasures are just too easy for advanced countries. So in the 1960s, things began to change, and in the very early 70s, we had the Strategic Arms Limitation talks and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, where we gave away the right to have ballistic missile defenses. That was a very conscious decision after a great deal of analysis. Now, there had been lots of work on defenses, and yes, we could make them work to some extent in the sense that missiles would fly and radars would see and and you could network radars, you could do all sorts of things. But frankly, by the time I entered the defense business, the only thing the United States worried about was, is there any way that the Soviets can be really sneaky and make their ballistic missile defenses work, even though we shouldn't let them do it, but if we weren't watching and they were clever, could they do something bad? We're not even serious about ballistic missile defense ourselves. Now, in the early 80s, this all changed. It changed partly because technology had improved and better defenses were more feasible. It changed partly because of ideas and, if you like, ideology, and I'm going to come back to that because it's a really very important point. But in any case, it was decided that we would pursue the so-called Strategic Defense Initiative, which was to be a space-based ballistic missile defense system of really very impressive proportions. Well, we spent a lot of money on that, but things were actually very similar to what they had been earlier. If you had to choose sides, would you rather be the engineer designing the countermeasures or the engineer designing the defenses? The countermeasures have it easier. And so by the end of the 80s, that program had sort of gone away again. In the 1990s, not much of anything happened. It was just R&D. And that was nothing. But then, and now this is where the transition begins to what's relevant at this conference. In the late 1990s, there was a commission chaired by Donald Rumsfeld, who later became Secretary of Defense. And one of the things that came out of that panel was the recognition that it wasn't just the Soviet Union anymore and the Chinese. There were these other countries coming along who were going to have nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. And although I was not on that commission and I cannot quote them directly, I am quite certain that what bothered many of the people on the commission most, including Mr. Rumsfeld, was how can we, the United States, be naked, and I want to use that term, naked, against the North Koreans or the Iranians or, how could this cannot be. And so in the early Bush administration, President Bush and Secretary Rumsfeld pushed very hard to actually deploy ballistic missile defense systems. So this was no longer research and development. We were going to deploy something. And the reasons were, again, pretty interesting. One is technology had come along. A second was that there was a belief that it wasn't good enough to just do things on paper. If you actually built something, you might actually know how to do it, and you might get better and better and discover you could do things that were better than you realized. And besides which, again, we couldn't be naked. So the United States actually deployed a fairly well-advertised ground-based interceptor system. It went operational, not with very much testing, but it is an operational system today, and it's surprisingly good for what it's designed to do. We also were designing and building and deploying a naval-based ballistic missile defense system, and that has had really quite a remarkable series of technical successes, including shooting down the Chinese satellite that was coming to Earth. And if you think about it, that was a really big deal. It was
our satellite.
Yes, sorry. It was a really big deal because if it had failed, it would have been embarrassing. And so if there's a question about whether if the capability is real, that was an indication that you can build these things. All right, now how does this relate to what we're talking about? In the case of South Korea, certainly, and Japan to a lesser degree, ballistic missile defense is technically feasible to a degree. The missiles are shorter range, as Dr. Bonomo said. They don't have a long out of the atmosphere period. There are things that one can do. Countermeasures are more difficult. So it's not absurd. the defenses are also less expensive. The argument about not being naked certainly applies even more, you would think, to South Korea than to the United States in worrying about a North Korea or an Iran. So there's a reason. But now we get into the dilemmas. The dilemmas are, and they exist as long as these issues of ballistic missile defense have been debated. There are countermeasures. It's very difficult to know that the defense will work at all. And if it works at all, it's limited by the numbers. If you only have 48 units, that, how much does that do? They're expensive. There are other things to do with the money. So is this really worth doing? These are not easy questions, but they are fundamentally different for a country like South Korea than for the United States in thinking about intercontinental things. And I think Dr. Bonomo, one of his most important points was, think about it as just another element of defense. Does it make sense to put more in this, less, how much, and so forth? What I would end up with is actually something similar to what both speakers said, either explicitly or implicitly, however. If one is going to go down that path, why in heaven's name would you spend money on bad systems? Don't you think they should at least work for what they're designed against, for some of the threat they are dealing with? So this would suggest that if South Korea goes down this route, it should pay a lot of attention to the nuts and bolts, the command and control, the intelligence, the reliability, and the technical performance of the systems. Now, is that useful if not enough will be bought to really provide a really good defense? Good question. It would arguably be better not to buy anything at all than have something that doesn't work. But there's one issue that wasn't mentioned that I had on my list that I really wanted to talk about, and that is, if we go all the way back to the beginnings of the debates about deterrence and so forth, the hardest issues have always been, what if it isn't all or nothing? Yes, if North Korea launched a massive attack against South Korea, no defense that's going to be built in my lifetime would do much good. But that's not very likely anyway because of retaliation. The North Koreans probably would not like what they happened to them as a result. But what about limited provocations or limited attacks or limited anything? Well, the answer to that could be defenses. Limited defense would provide the ability to deter limited attacks if they worked. But then there are other ways that can be thought about to deter or deal with limited attacks or incursions or provocations. And one of the things that I don't see in debate, and this is not unique to South Korea, it's true of Taiwan, it's true of Japan, it's what are the options that will be available to the political leaders in the event of limited attacks, incursions, fait accompli, to use a term that was used earlier today. What will be the set of options available? And if they aren't very good, what has to be done to develop them? And what are the best of them that should get investments? These have always been the kinds of hard questions. For the United States, it was back in Germany. What if the Soviets decided not to invade Western Europe again, but rather just to take over Berlin, or just to do something a little bit? Would we start a general nuclear war? Well, no. Well, what would we do? And a great deal of effort went into developing limited options, both limited nuclear options, better conventional defenses, economic mechanisms. So this, I think, is the primary strategic question as we are now in a period in Asia where these problems are just not going to go away. I think the notion of putting the genie back in the bottle and so forth are so absurd, I don't understand how people can talk about them anymore. But then the question is, well, what do you do instead? Well, you can talk about capping. Maybe there's negotiations and dissuasion, but there have to be some mechanisms either to defend or to deter in a credible way. So when I look at defense in the context of our discussions here, I see the ballistic missile defenses as one tool to be competed against other mechanisms for improving deterrence of the people you're concerned about, or going beyond that defense. But if you get serious about that, the answer becomes offense, and that's another whole different world, and I don't see much enthusiasm for preemptively addressing threats by invading a North Korea or something. And if that's not going to happen, then deterrence is going to be the key. Anyway, those are my thoughts. Can we open things up now and then let the panel go forth? Yeah, Mr. Coleman.
Thank you very much. Hi, Elbridge Colby, Center for Naval Analysis. Thank you very much. This is a question for Mr. Kim in particular. I was really interested in your discussion of mutual vulnerability and its advantages in the Korean Peninsula, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what the implications for the Republic's force posture would be. I mean, you know, in the U.S. context, that often means the ability to execute strikes of great destructiveness, often nuclear, which presumably is not what you're talking about. But I was just wondering if you could talk about what are the implications for force structure, and what are your bases for, what do you mean by vulnerability when you talk about the North Korean? What do you think needs to be held vulnerable? Thanks.
Can I? Yeah. Force structure. Well, basically, we need both defense and deterrence. So no doubt about that. You know. So one is, this is not the question of which is right or wrong. You know. Both are right, definitely right. But the question is how to allocate our money and effort to both of them. Then we should talk about how to assess our threat. Everything should come from the assessment of our threat, you know. When we talk about the intensity of a threat, the largest threat is, of course, possibility of all-out war or all-out attack. But the lesson, a precious lesson from the Yeonpyeong Island and the Cheonan incident is that when we talk about the threat in frequency, the biggest, most serious threat is provocations. So we need to explain a lot more, you know, if we exactly understand why this provocation can threaten our existence. You know. If we allow North Korea to continue this type of provocations, then we will lose our right to respond. You know. Now North Korea is armed with the WMDs. Then the South Korean people increasingly psychologically afraid and getting afraid. Or how can we deal with those guys, nuclear armed North Korea? So then commit the provocation, then increasing number of South Korean people can think, oh, okay, we should tolerate. We cannot fight with them. You know. If we allow this to repeat over and over, then South Korea will lose any right and opportunity to respond. You know. And in the future, if the still more increasing number of South Korean voters think that way, then someday North Korea may be able to select the South Korean government. This is serious. I'm talking about the existence of democratic principles in this land. You know. So then I can answer to your question. You know. Okay, we should spend more money on defense, but first of all, we should prevent provocations. Then our force structure should be changed in that direction. We should spend more money to deter their schemes to provocate against us, rather than trying to defend after their provocations. So that's why I talked about early purchase of stealth fighters and more submarines and more ground-based missiles in our hand. This doesn't mean that the South Korea can use this to the first strike using this nonsense, but by showing our capability and will to respond in case of a provocation, then we can prevent their bad scheme. So that's the basic theory.
Hi, this is Naeem Ahmed, and I teach at the University of Karachi, Pakistan. My question is to Dr. Bonomo. Your focus of discussion was South Korea. Let me, expand the scenario and include other regions into this debate, such as South Asia and Middle Eastern region, where there are countries which oppose and support the US NMD program, where in case of South Asia, India supports and Pakistan has outrightly rejected. And even on the day when the American President George Bush announced this program, the Chinese Prime Minister was in Pakistan. So, and he outrightly rejected this, program. So all these regions and the development, all these things are interrelated. So my question is, don't you think the transfer of this technology to other states in these regions, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Middle Eastern region, would further enhance the regional and global arms race? And secondly, to what extent this program, when it is transferred, will enhance the security of the recipient states? Because the whole debate of haves and have-nots and the nuclear deterrence has changed now. So I like to listen to your views. Thank you.
A clarification. When you said this program, you're talking about the transfer of missile defense technologies.
Yeah, it's a TMD program.
Right. Well, let me first clarify some things here that I was saying, because I, in fact, do agree more than we might have thought with Mr. Kim. The potential of the short-range defenses, TMD, the U.S. THAADs and Aegis and so forth, they are very unlikely to provide a assured defense against a nuclear attack. For one thing, many of them are not designed to work in a nuclear environment, that is, when one actually explodes. So if one is preemptively blown up high in the atmosphere, your bet is as good as mine as how these will work. And if some get through and you're shooting at cities, well, this is very, very bad. So in terms of deploying these defenses to other nations, particularly ones where there's some sort of a nuclear arms race or competition, as in South Asia, between India and Pakistan, it's not going to affect the ability of either nation to hold fundamentally the cities of the others at risk. What it does interrupt are the things that both Paul and Dr. Kim have talked about the ability of either side to, or the side attacking the side with defenses, to execute very small ballistic missile attacks with impunity, either to terrorize civilians or because you wish to gain an initial advantage in some war. Then defenses, oh, well, I'm not quite sure if that'll work. I can't trust that small attack. So in terms of an arms race, which you also ask about, so first, in terms of the stability, I don't think the defenses at that level are going to interrupt your fundamental stability. You still can both hold one another's countries at risk. In terms of some sort of war fighting, though, it does in fact have defenses can have an interesting effect. By removing those small options, they can raise the barrier to war. I no longer can simply toss a missile off and feel good that it's going to work. In fact, I have to do something bigger, and I'm not sure I want to do that. How are they going to respond? So in fact, the presence of defenses can have a stabilizing effect there. The provision of defenses can have some diffusion of technology. There can be some crossover between the missile designs, depending on what is transferred. In terms of an arms race, well, I think the arms race that I worry about more and the stability I worry about more are when the two sides are close together and there's just an unlimited competition on ballistic missiles. Can I get there fast enough? Can I take out his forces? Again, defenses can have a stabilizing effect there, rather as any sort of survivable nuclear force could. And then again, in any sort of use of missiles in a conventional conflict, defenses become just one of another thing you need to consider in your, however each nation makes its allocation decisions. If all your helicopter admirals wish to buy helicopters, you're not going to buy missile defenses, but that's a flaw in the decision-making process of that country. And it's just another element to be weighed. Does that answer your question? You can catch me later to discuss more. Please. Have to get to you, Bruce.
Hi, Bruce McDonald with the United States Institute of Peace. There's kind of a contradiction buried in U.S. missile defense policy, but that I'll bring out in just a moment. There's a strong case has been made, I think, by all three of you gentlemen, that there's a real validity and value in having at least limited defenses, particularly I would argue, at a strategic level. And in fact, that's endorsed in the report of the Congressional Commission on the Strategic Posture of the United States. I was privileged to serve on the staff supporting that. But the report is very clear that it says that defenses, we should not go after defenses sufficient to cause Russia or China, and that really the or China thing was, I can tell you from the inside, was interesting that that was accepted. The logic of all that, and coupled with the compelling logic of your presentations, is that missile defense up to a certain level makes sense, but that if you go too much beyond that, you potentially can create problems that for yourself and for your allies, and that was specifically mentioned in this report. How then to deal with the problem, the United States saying we won't accept in the strategic negotiations, we will not accept any limits at all on missile defense. Is there a way to square that circle? Because Russia seems to be very clear that what buys them any street credibility, if you will, is its nuclear forces, and they don't want to see anything to upset, potentially threaten the credibility of their forces, since all this ultimately is political. And then also, the Posture Commission report talks about the importance of not posing too great a threat. In fact, that China's buildup in its ICBM force may, in fact, be related to the deployment of U.S. missile defenses. In any event, what are your suggestions for how we square this circle? I mean, I look for it, and I don't see much of an answer.
Yeah, I'll take a first cut at that. If the world were rational, I think it's not very difficult. But it's also moot, because if the world were rational, none of the advanced countries would try to build such ambitious defenses, because we know that they won't work. Therefore, there wouldn't be an issue. The world is not rational, unfortunately, and perceptions matter a great deal, and posturing and so forth. That's in the political domain, and I at least don't have a solution to the issue or anything wise to say.
Well, I doubt I have anything wise to add either, but I'll talk for just a moment. I completely, talking just for myself here, certainly not representing RAND or the U.S., the Russians have a point. A competition where the U.S. is building defenses against very long-range missiles and they always worry about a U.S. technical surprise because we've done it to them in the past, and maybe these now 500 missiles actually are all capable, and well, that's a very unstable arms race sort of situation. It can even be unstable in a crisis because they would not want to suffer a first strike and then, oh, well, maybe now our small, when in fact, our long-range defenses are highly unlikely to be effective against an advanced nation, as Paul mentioned, and certainly includes Russia and China. So that race is a dumb race to be running. I think the answer is that we will satisfy the Russians, between the U.S. and Russia, and the Chinese, by simply not being foolish. I'm hoping for more rationality than Paul is. But this is a dynamic that is in a certain measure reserved here for these missiles. For the short-range case that South Korea faces, there is no feasible way that anyone would believe a system would effectively intercept 1,000 missiles. So if they simply wait a while and throw in a few nukes at the end of 1,000 or many hundred, they're going to get through. Or at least you're not going to trust your defenses. So it's a different dynamic here than it is for the strategic calculus that we used to debate so much. And I'm hoping that we can be stable as a result simply by refraining from a foolish competition.
Yeah. Question back here?
I have a question to Mr. Kim. I found many similarities on the missile defense debate in Japan and in Korea, especially in the prioritization, Chinese reaction, and technical difficulties. After the Japanese government decided to make a decision on the deployment in 2003, the government killed modified some procurement program for conventional equipment to have to find out money for missile defense. And after that, before that decision, China criticized our discussion, but after that, China stopped that. So I totally agree. Your thinking of the philosophy is very important. And my question is about something related to technical difficulties. Finally, Japanese decision of the missile defense deployment is minimum defense, just for reassurance. And this kind of deployment can work to reassure the public against South Korean and North Korean provocation. So in that sense, I think South Korean missile defense can work, as we discussed, can work for to improve the strategic balance to North Korea. And I'd like to ask you, how do you think of the Japan-US ROK Trilateral Missile Defense Cooperation? Japan has missile defense asset, and the U.S. has a missile defense asset, and the U.S. has a conventional strike capability asset, both from Korean Peninsula and from Japanese U.S. force in Japan. And Korea can contribute to Korea-based ISR network. So this kind of trilateral connection will improve the missile defense, both missile defense and the conventional strike, something like you are saying the conventional triad against North Korea. So how do you think of the possibility of U.S., Japan, Korea trilateral missile defense?
Yes, the former part of your remarks, this is what I want to convey that to our government, even though it may have been very controversial within Japan, how far Japan will participate in the U.S. initiated missile defense. But once decided that China stopped the criticism, this is a lesson we should take. I think, okay, the latter part, yes, the minimum defense. This is the concept we also should adopt. As the two gentlemen emphasized over here, South Korea definitely need ways to deal with the limited provocations. So the defense is a good way to contain the damage from the North Korean limited the provocations. And also it has some political and psychological roles. This is very important, I'm thinking about the government, the nature of government. If we have a very different nature of government in the future, then the whole debate can be changed. So I'm always thinking about that possibility. We have to maintain the principles and the values. So in that sense, yes, we need that. And then this is the area we can cooperate. So what I emphasized in my presentation is that even while we accept the importance of the missile defense for limited role, but still what may be more important is how to deter, how to prevent North Korean provocation before it occurs. So if we allocate reasonably our money and effort, then everything will be fine. And then finally, trilateral cooperation. That's what the topic we have discussed for last couple of years. For myself, and I've been involved in many times, this is the right time to do that. Right time, exactly right time to do that. Unfortunately, we have some emotional, historical matters unsolved. In that regard, I hope the Japanese government will take some initiative. Then the South Korean public, I think, it will be more than ready than before.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
That's a good place to wrap up, and we are told it is now time for us to think about things like dinner.
This is the end of session scheduled for today. The opening dinner for the Asan Plenum will be held at the Lotte Hotel immediately following this.